Millionaire catches Maid playing horse with his sons. What he did next changed everything. It was an afternoon that should have been ordinary, yet it opened a doorway Gabriel Rourke never expected to find. He had come home early, not because his schedule allowed it, but because exhaustion had pressed too heavily on him to bear. Since Sophie's passing, his coastal estate had felt like a museum steeped in shadows, quiet, cold, and absent of anything alive. But today, as the heavy wooden door closed behind him, Gabriel heard a sound his heart had nearly forgotten. Laughter. Not the polite kind traded in boardrooms, not the hollow smiles he had worn like armor in front of donors and colleagues. This was pure, ringing laughter, unrestrained, breaking open like waves crashing against rock. He stopped, each step toward the living room heavy and hesitant. From the doorway, Gabriel saw a scene that caught his breath. Mara Bennett, the woman hired only to maintain order within these walls, was down on the rug, her hair loose and tousled, a wool scarf tied lightly at her neck like reins on a horse. Jonah sat astride her back, squealing through his laughter, while Finn ran alongside, clutching the other end of the scarf, tugging and steering his steed across the wide floor. The room glowed, not with lamps or sunlight, but with joy so alive it nearly hurt to witness. Jonah and Finn were laughing, for the first time in months. Gabriel stood still, his hand tightening around the doorframe, unwilling to breathe too loudly for fear of shattering the spell. In that instant, he was not a tech mogul, not a widower draped in wealth, not even the father who had failed to summon joy for his sons. He was simply a man, stunned by the miracle before him. Laughter had returned to the house that he thought had forgotten how to breathe. Before that laughter returned, the Rourke house had been nothing but silence, thick and unmoving, like dust clinging to stone walls. After Sophie's death, Gabriel chose the only escape he knew, burying himself in work. The office became his shelter, endless meetings his shield, quarterly reports and strategic plans, a sedative dulling the unnamed ache that lived inside him. The coastal estate, meant to be a home, had turned into something mechanical and sterile. Meal schedules were printed and posted on the kitchen board like hotel notices. Staff moved about quietly, like shadows unwilling to disturb the air. The long hallways echoed only with the sound of Gabriel's footsteps, each strike of his polished shoes sharp and judicial, as though announcing a verdict no one wanted to hear. But the harshest truth was written in his sons. Jonah, once curious and full of restless questions, now curled tightly into himself at night, clutching a worn teddy bear as though it were his only lifeline. Finn, who used to hum tuneless songs all day, spoke only in fragments now, half-sentences that felt safer than words stretched too far. The quiet between them was not just the absence of sound. It was proof of a family dissolving under grief, piece by invisible piece. And then Mara Bennett arrived. She was not hired to heal. Her contract listed practical tasks only: oversee household operations, manage the staff, maintain order. She entered with the discretion of someone fully aware she was an outsider. No noise, no performance, no intrusion. Yet through the smallest acts, her presence began to soften the frozen edges of the house. She noticed the things no one else saw, replacing the flowers in the hallway vase each morning, folding the blanket Jonah abandoned on the couch, setting a small nightlight in Finn's room to chase away the dark. These gestures went unspoken, unrecorded in any agreement, but somehow they made the estate feel less like a mausoleum and more like a dwelling meant for the living. At first, Gabriel dismissed it. To him, Mara was only another cog in a long-established household machine, but slowly, almost reluctantly, he began to notice the change, not in the furniture or the stonework, but in his sons. Jonah slept deeper, less restless. Finn, from time to time, strung together whole sentences again, tentative but real. And through those tiny fractures, a first thin light seeped back in. In that moment, Gabriel stood frozen in the doorway, his chest heavy with something at once foreign and painfully familiar. He had braced himself for emptiness, for the hollow quiet of a house where only the wind against glass and the tick of a clock dared to speak. Instead, he stumbled into a scene so vivid it rattled the stone his heart had become. On the wide rug at the center of the living room, Mara Bennett crawled on all fours, her dark hair falling loose, her cheeks flushed with laughter. Perched proudly on her back was Jonah, squealing in delight, his giggles ringing out like bells. Beside them, Finn clutched a wool scarf tied lightly around Mara's neck, tugging it as if it were reins, his face lit with pure joy as he steered his human steed across the floor. Laughter filled the cavernous space, ricocheting off high ceilings, bouncing through glass panes that overlooked the restless sea. It wasn't laughter meant to appease. It wasn't the dry chuckles Gabriel often endured at galas and fundraisers. This was raw, unguarded, unmanufactured joy, so real it tore through the veil of mourning that had smothered the house for far too long. His fingers pressed hard into the doorframe until his knuckles whitened. Part of him wanted to step in, to say something, perhaps a thank you, perhaps just the boys' names. But another part trembled, afraid that even the smallest interruption would shatter the fragile miracle before him. Within that laughter, Gabriel heard Sophie. He remembered afternoons when she crawled across the floor with the twins on her back, laughing until her sides ached. He heard her voice again. Real love leaves marks on your body. Those are the ones worth keeping. The memory sliced and soothed all at once. Mara hadn't noticed him yet. She was immersed fully in the world she'd built for his children, neighing dramatically, tossing her head so wildly that Jonah nearly toppled from her back, while Finn collapsed in giggles, trying to keep hold of the scarf. The sight tightened Gabriel's throat. He had thought distance was noble, that discipline and order were the balm his boys required. But here was the truth, undeniable. What they needed was life, unedited, unstructured, alive. When Mara's eyes finally lifted and found him, the room shifted. Her laughter stopped. She froze where she was, posture straightening as though she'd been caught misbehaving. Jonah slid off her back. Finn dropped the scarf, his gaze flickering nervously to his father. The air thickened, not with judgment or rebuke, but with reverence, like two people caught in the presence of something too sacred to name. Gabriel said nothing. He let the silence stretch, let his heart relearn its rhythm. And then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Just enough. Enough for Jonah to inch back toward Mara, enough for Finn to giggle again. In that nod lay an unspoken confession. She had returned what he could not. Laughter. Gabriel lingered a moment longer before quietly turning away, his heart heavier than his footsteps. He didn't know what this would mean tomorrow or the day after, but for the first time in many months, he felt something that resembled hope. Not forced, not rational, real. And that changed everything. For the first time since Sophie's death, his children were alive again. They were laughing, and it was Mara who had called them back from silence. The next morning, Gabriel woke with the memory of the day before clinging to him, like the echo of something sacred he wasn't sure he deserved to witness. The image of Finn and Jonah laughing uncontrollably while perched on Mara's back lodged deep inside him, leaving a knot he couldn't quite untangle. At breakfast, he barely touched his coffee as he stood by the kitchen island, watching. Mara moved with quiet steadiness. No performance, no exaggeration, only gentleness with intent. She spoke to the little boys when they appeared, without noticing or pretending not to notice that Gabriel stood close enough to hear. Finn asked if she could read the story of the bear and the moon again that night. Jonah, his voice still trembling, whispered about drawing her a picture. Gabriel said nothing, his fingers tightening faintly around the porcelain cup. Gratitude tangled with something unnamed, tender and dangerous as a live wire. He knew he owed her something, at least acknowledgement. But saying it aloud would be opening a door he wasn't ready to step through. And yet, when the children tugged at her apron, not his, the truth pressed heavy against his chest. They were moving forward while he remained still. All that day, Gabriel kept his distance, though his eyes often strayed toward her. Mara never sought him out, and somehow that unsettled him more than if she had. She didn't try to explain away what had happened yesterday in the living room. She didn't apologize. Even when their eyes met in the hallway, she wasn't flustered. Her presence remained steady, her care for the boys unwavering. Not a show, not an attempt to impress. It simply was. When Finn scraped his knee on the stairs, she soothed him with a soft word and a firm hand. No drama. When Jonah grew frustrated with a puzzle piece and nearly hurled it away, Mara didn't scold. She knelt beside him, waited until his breathing steadied, and only then offered help. Gabriel watched it all from the edges of his life, like a man seeing his own existence translated into another language. And each time she looked at the boys, truly looked, he saw in her something he struggled to name. Perhaps motherliness, or simply humanity. She was becoming what the children needed, and that truth both comforted him and terrified him. That night, Gabriel lingered longer in the hallway outside the twins' room. He stood still as Mara read to them. Her voice was soft yet rhythmic, more expressive than he had imagined. The boys giggled, even when the story wasn't funny. Jonah interrupted with genuine questions, and Mara answered with the kind of patience Gabriel had once seen in Sophie. At one point, Finn rested his head on her lap, and Mara instinctively laid a hand on his hair, stroking as if she had done so for years. Gabriel felt like a stranger in his own house, in his own story. Bedtime, once a battlefield of tantrums and silence, had become something strangely tender, full, and he wasn't part of it. He should have felt relief. He should have walked away, content that his sons were finally being embraced again by something resembling love. But he didn't. He stood there in the hushed hallway, half hidden in shadow, gazing through the cracked door like a window into a life he could no longer reach. That night, unable to sleep, Gabriel drifted through the house as he often did, not restless, avoidant. The master bedroom still carried the faint lavender lotion of Sophie, and the sheet on her side of the bed remained untouched, which he refused to change. Instead, he wandered from room to room, a ritual worn into habit. But this night his feet led him to the library. The reading lamp cast a muted glow, and as he entered, he saw her. Mara curled in the far corner of the leather chair, barefoot, a book open in her lap. She hadn't heard him. For a fleeting second, he thought to leave quietly, but something rooted him there. Perhaps it was the way she looked so at peace, alone, yet not lonely. Perhaps it was the naturalness of her presence in the silence of the house. He cleared his throat softly. She turned. "Can't sleep either?" she asked quietly. He nodded, stepping further in. Without sitting right away, he traced his fingers along a row of spines before turning back to her. "What are you reading?" His voice was rough from disuse. She lifted the cover. "A Toni Morrison novel." He nodded again, this time with a flicker of interest or guilt. Moments later, he took a seat across from her. Not too near, not too far. The quiet wasn't heavy or awkward. It held like a room with all the windows open. Mara didn't rush to fill it, and Gabriel was grateful for that. After a long pause, he said, "Yesterday, they laughed." Truly laughed? Mara didn't answer immediately. She marked her page, closed the book gently. "They needed that," she said simply, her voice calm, unguarded. "They've been without it too long." He stared at the fireplace, though it held no flame. "I don't know how to give that to them," he admitted. Mara didn't say, "I noticed." She didn't say, "They need you." She didn't say anything that could wound him. She only said, "You're doing what you can." Somehow that pierced deeper than any reproach. Not praise, not pity. Understanding. Gabriel exhaled, like a man realizing he had been holding his breath too long. For the first time, they were no longer employer and employee, no longer widower and housekeeper. Just two people breathing the same air, sharing the same invisible weight. They didn't linger long in the library. A few minutes later, Mara softly said, "Good night, Mr. Rourke." And Gabriel answered without thinking, "Good night, Mara." No formality, no ritual, just a name, her real name. When she disappeared down the hall, he remained, sitting in the same silence that had haunted him for months. But now it no longer felt so heavy. Something unspoken had passed between them, an acknowledgement of grief, effort, quiet endurance. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or whether this fragile thread would hold. But as he rose to switch off the lamp, he could feel it. A connection. No, not love yet, but sacred and cautious, a shared breath in the season of mourning. In that silent library, they had taken their first steps into each other's lives, not with apologies or promises, but with presence. For the first time, Gabriel was no longer alone in his own house, and that was enough. It was well past midnight when the silence of the Rourke house shattered. A scream ripped through the second floor, raw and urgent, the kind of sound that twists a parent's gut. "Mommy!" Then the pounding of small feet on cold floors. Mara shot up instantly, instinct ahead of thought, already halfway to the door when the cry came again. She didn't hesitate. She had heard cries like this before, not the same, but the kind pulled out of nightmares that grief refuses to release. She rushed into the hallway to find Jonah trembling, barefoot, clutching a stuffed rabbit in one hand, rubbing his eyes with the other. His little body shook in spasms, the terror in his gaze heavier than what a 4-year-old should bear. Mara dropped to her knees. "Shh, sweetheart. It's all right. I'm here. Let me hold you," she whispered, pulling him into her arms. Jonah didn't resist. He collapsed against her chest with the trust of someone who had nowhere else left to hide. She rocked instinctively, humming the tune her grandmother used to sing on stormy nights. Her voice, low and steady, met the boy's shattered breaths, like balm on an open wound. Moments later, Gabriel appeared at the end of the hall, breathless, in a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants. He froze, watching. His son, Jonah, curled in Mara's arms as though that was where he belonged. And Mara, barefoot, unwavering, knelt as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Gabriel's chest tightened with the familiar ache of helplessness. His first impulse was to step forward, to take Jonah, to reassert the father's claim that felt more fragile by the day. But he stopped. There was something in the way Mara held the boy, hands firm but not possessive, her cheek resting lightly on his curls, her humming even and sure, that stilled him. She wasn't giving pity. She was giving presence, a presence Gabriel hadn't managed to offer in months. Slowly, he stepped closer and knelt beside them. His eyes searched hers, hesitant, asking. She didn't look away, didn't flinch. Her humming softened, but her arms didn't loosen. Jonah's sobs had quieted now, replaced by ragged breaths and murmured words Gabriel couldn't catch. He reached out, brushing hair off his son's damp forehead with trembling fingers. "Is he okay?" Gabriel asked, voice hoarse. Mara nodded. "Just scared." The nightmare was loud, she murmured. Jonah stirred at his father's voice, but didn't lift his head. Gabriel's hand hovered, then fell to his thigh. "He called for Sophie," he muttered, the name slipping from his throat like gravel. Mara didn't answer right away. She looked down at the boy, now slowly relaxing. "Does this happen often?" she asked softly. "Finn cries sometimes," Gabriel swallowed hard. "But Jonah, he screams, and he doesn't go back to sleep. Since—" His voice trailed off. Mara lifted her gaze to him, open, unjudging. "You don't need to finish that sentence," she whispered. "I know where it ends." Her words didn't push him away. They pulled him nearer. In that moment, Gabriel was seen, not as the billionaire father, not as the widower, but as a man with a child breaking in his arms and no idea how to mend him. Mara shifted slightly, still holding Jonah, whose breathing had steadied, eyelids heavy. "Do you want me to carry him back to bed?" she asked gently, leaving the choice open. Gabriel shook his head. "Let him stay like this," he said, surprising even himself. He wasn't ready to cut short the fragile peace that had returned to his son's face. He watched Jonah burrow deeper into her chest, tiny fingers clutching her sleeve. "How do you do that?" he asked after a pause. "He's never let anyone hold him like this, not even me." Mara lowered her eyes for a beat before lifting them again. "It's not about what I do. It's about what I am." Her voice was soft, but the words rang with a truth sharp and undeniable. Children don't need perfection. Most of the time, they don't need answers. They just need someone to sit in the dark with them and not leave. The hallway sank into a silence that felt reverent. Gabriel's hands rested loosely on his knees. His body forgot what it felt like to simply be with his child, without trying to fix him. Then Mara looked at him again, her voice steady, yet trembling slightly, both challenge and compassion. "They don't need you to pretend to be strong, Mr. Rourke," she said quietly. "They need you. Here." The words struck him like a stone, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. For months he had worn the armor of control and stature, believing it shielded his sons from the chaos inside him. But the simpler, sadder truth was this. They didn't need a fortress. They needed a father, one who could kneel, stay, listen, even when the words broke apart. Gabriel looked at his son nestled in Mara's arms, and something inside him cracked open. He didn't cry, not yet. But the tears waited, standing by for permission. Mara said nothing more. She let the silence stretch between them like a bridge, not a wall. Gabriel reached out again, not to fix, but to feel. His hand rested gently on Jonah's back as the boy slept, his small body rising and falling in rhythm with Mara's breathing. They stayed like that for a long time, 3 of them, sitting in the shadowed hallway. At last Jonah stirred, exhaling a long sigh, the kind that marked the end of a nightmare. For the first time since Sophie's death, he fell back asleep, not in panic or tension, but in trust. Gabriel recognized it in the loosened weight of his son's limbs, in the surrender of sleep that only comes when a child feels safe. He looked at Mara for a long time and mouthed the words he couldn't yet speak aloud. "Thank you." Her gaze met his, steady, open. She nodded once, slow, sure. There was no flare of triumph, no hint of superiority, only empathy of someone who had walked through darkness and chosen to stay when others turned away. Gabriel rose carefully so as not to wake Jonah. Mara stood as well, still carrying the boy. Together, they brought him back to his room. At the doorway, Gabriel paused. "He hasn't fallen back asleep since that night," he whispered. Mara turned slightly, the child resting peacefully in her arms. "I know," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "Tonight, he did." Then she stepped inside, laying Jonah down, without another word. Gabriel remained alone in the hall, the weight of her words lingering like both shadow and map upon him. The fragile peace that had just begun to take root was quickly disrupted, not from within the house, but from the world outside. That afternoon, Evelyn Pierce, Sophie's mother, arrived unannounced. A sleek black car pulled up to the gate, and moments later, the elegant, sharp-featured woman stepped into the living room. Mara greeted her with practiced courtesy, carrying a silver tray of tea. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pierce," she said with a soft smile. But the reply was nothing more than a thin, polite curve of lips. Evelyn's eyes flicked over Mara, measuring, weighing, as if calculating how much space she dared to occupy. Jonah burst into the room, face alight. "Mara!" He threw his arms around her waist, his laughter spilling free. Finn followed, tugging at her sleeve, whispering something only she could hear. It happened so naturally that Evelyn faltered, her expression tightening, her composure cracking for just a breath. Her gaze lingered too long, cold, appraising. Mara felt it immediately. The boy's affection had become a thorn in the older woman's eye. That evening, Gabriel sat with Evelyn in the sitting room. The tea was gone, the smiles gone. Only her voice remained, low, deliberate, sharp as glass. "Gabriel, I know you're grieving, but you must understand, people are watching. A young woman living under your roof, with the children clinging to her. What do you think they're saying?" Gabriel stayed quiet, though his eyes sharpened. Evelyn slid a tabloid across the polished wood. On its cover, a grainy photograph, Mara carrying a sleeping Finn against her shoulder as she walked through the garden. The headline screamed, "Housekeeper? Or replacement?" He glanced at it once, then set it aside, his breath heavy. "She saved my sons," Gabriel said slowly. "She brought laughter back into this house." "And scandal as well," Evelyn countered, her tone unbending. The conversation ended there, but its weight clung to the walls like smoke. 2 days later, Mara saw the paper herself. Someone in the kitchen had left it open on the counter, carelessly or perhaps intentionally. The photo, the twisted headline, the insinuation, it all dragged her out of the fragile safety she'd begun to trust, thrusting her back into a battlefield she had never agreed to enter. That entire day, Mara moved more quietly than usual, her footsteps soft, her voice subdued, her smile faint and fragile. Jonah sensed it instantly, clinging to her with anxious eyes. Finn asked softly, "Are you mad at us?" Mara bent down, kissed the crown of his head. "Never," she whispered, but inside she trembled. That night, alone in her room, Mara pulled a suitcase from beneath the bed. Her fingers hovered over the zipper, her chest aching. Leaving might be the cleanest solution, for Gabriel, for the boys, for herself. Better to go before anyone forced her, before her presence became a burden too heavy to bear. But then, memory pressed in. Gabriel's eyes the night Jonah had fallen asleep in her arms, the crack in his voice when he had nearly whispered "thank you." Those moments held her still. The suitcase remained shut. The next morning she found a folded slip of paper tucked under her door, only her name written in Gabriel's hand. Inside, a single line, "Please come to the office." The next morning, as Mara sat folding the boys' clothes with trembling hands, a slip of paper slid under her door. Just 2 words. Mara. Office. The handwriting was firm, unmistakable. Gabriel's. Her heart raced as she approached the heavy wooden door. Gabriel stood behind his desk, the crumpled tabloid in his hand. His face was tense, but his voice gentler than she expected. "Sit," he said. Mara obeyed, her fingers laced tightly in her lap, bracing herself for dismissal. For a long moment, he only looked at her. Then he asked, slowly but clearly, "Did you think I'd let them take you away from the boys?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Gabriel circled the desk, lowering himself into the chair opposite hers, no longer master and employee, but 2 people facing one another. "If you leave, my sons will lose the only person who's made them feel safe since Sophie died," Gabriel continued. He paused, his eyes shifting, unsteady. "And I'll lose the only reason this house doesn't feel like a tomb anymore." His voice cracked, not with anger, but with the weight of truth. Mara blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that threatened. "I never meant to cause trouble," she whispered. "I'm afraid of what they'll say, to the boys, to you." Gabriel leaned forward, hands clenched. "Then we fight by standing still, not running." Silence stretched, fragile but binding. Mara nodded at last, trembling but steadier than before. Gabriel reached out, not as a man rescuing a subordinate, but as someone pleading not to be abandoned. "Stay." One word, heavy as a vow. Mara placed her hand in his, and in that moment she knew, this time she would not be fighting alone. That evening the twins burst into her room, giggling, carrying toys, unaware of the quiet battle waged in whispers beyond their reach. She welcomed them as she did every day, but now with the silent strength of someone who had nearly left and had chosen to stay. Gabriel passed by the back door, stopped, listened, not just to the laughter, but to the voice beneath it, steady, calm, unshaken, the kind of voice that made his children believe the world could still be good. He didn't go in. He didn't need to. Something had shifted, not in the house, not in the public eye, but in the core of who he was, in the way he looked at her, not as a threat to his legacy, but as the reason that legacy might one day mean something. Mara never mentioned the newspaper again. Neither did he. Yet every time their eyes met in the hallway, there was an unspoken vow, and Gabriel's quiet promise to speak for what was true if the world came knocking again. Not now, not ever. For the first time she saw him, not as the employer, but as a man who had finally learned to fight, not for appearances, but for what he loved. One early summer afternoon, Jonah and Finn burst into Gabriel's study where he was reviewing blueprints. Both boys were panting, their faces flushed with excitement. "Dad," Jonah blurted so fast he nearly stumbled over the words. "We have something to ask." Gabriel looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "What is it, you two?" Finn glanced at Jonah, and together they clasped hands as if to draw courage. Finally, Jonah spoke. "Dad, can we call Mara?" "Mom?" The room froze. The ticking clock on the wall thundered in Gabriel's ears. He tightened his grip on the pen, eyes wide, heart clenched. He turned toward the doorway. Mara had just stepped in, halting mid-step, her hand braced against the wooden frame, her face a portrait of astonishment. Finn edged forward, his voice trembling but true. "She makes us feel safe. She reads to us. When I have nightmares, she's always there. I want to call her Mom." Tears spilled down Mara's cheeks. She covered her mouth, holding back a sob. Gabriel set his pen aside, rose, and slowly crossed the room. He knelt before the boys, placing steady hands on their shoulders. "Are you sure? This isn't a small thing?" Jonah nodded firmly. "We're sure. I miss Mom, but I know she isn't coming back. We don't want to replace her. We want Mara to stay. Forever." Gabriel felt the last of his walls collapse. He turned to Mara, his gaze carrying fear, gratitude, and something new. Faith. Slowly, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a folder he had kept ready. He handed it to Mara. Her eyes blurred as she read the bold heading. Joint Adoption Petition, Jonah Rourke, Finn Rourke. "I prepared this," Gabriel whispered, "because I knew someday the boys would ask. And today is that day?" Mara broke, sobs shaking her. She dropped to her knees, gathering Jonah and Finn into her arms. "If this is what you want, then it's exactly what I want too." The room seemed to glow with a light of its own, the joy of a family not born of blood, but of love and choice. In the months that followed, the coastal house transformed. No longer a silent museum of memories, it began to echo with the simple sounds of life. Small feet pounding down the hallways, laughter spilling from the kitchen, and Mara's soft humming as she hung laundry in the yard. Often Gabriel stood still in the shadows, listening. To others these were ordinary sounds. To him they were miracles, proof that the house that once lay dormant now lived again. One afternoon, Jonah and Finn tugged Mara into the living room. "Look, Mom," Jonah said, the words slipping out naturally, without hesitation. Mara froze, eyes shimmering, then bent down with a nod. "Mom is looking." On the table, the boys had built a fort out of pillows and blankets. They crawled inside, leaving a small gap for Mara. She followed them in, laughter erupting, and suddenly the room became another world, a kingdom of safety, warmth, and love. Gabriel watched from the doorway, silent, smiling. Before him was the vision Sophie had once dreamed of, a home not perfect, but alive. That evening, after the boys were tucked into bed, Gabriel and Mara sat on the porch, the sea breeze cool against their faces. He looked at the house and spoke softly. "You know, for a long time I called this place a house, but it was never truly a home. Now it is, because you stayed." Mara turned, her eyes bright beneath the moonlight. She didn't answer at once, only laid her hand over his. In that silence, something undeniable was clear. They were no longer alone, and the children, for the first time since loss, had a real family.